Didn't even do that. I just did that.
Okay, folks,
I feel
welcome.
better.
Welcome to our lecture this evening. My name is Leanne. I am the Educational Services Manager here at the Iron and Steel Heritage Museum. Our program tonight is titled, What If Things Were Made in America Again? Trading Away Steel Jobs. I'm here tonight to introduce our speaker, James Stuber. He is an attorney and an entrepreneur, and he also authored the book, What If Things Were Made in America Again, of which copies are available for purchase tonight. So if you are interested in that, you can do that after the program. Jim does have a family who does have a history in the steel industry, so that's kind of where his interest is piqued. And he does assert that as goes the steel mill, so goes the nation. So a large connection between the steel industry and the nation as well. His talk tonight will focus on a couple of questions posed in his book. Number one, why does it seem like everything is made elsewhere rather than in America? If that is a problem, how do we solve it as well? So he will propose a solution for us consumers to buy automobiles, home appliances, other products that are made in America, made with American steel as well. So please join me in welcoming Jim.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leanne.
You have your book with you tonight?
I do. There's some of them right there, and I even have more in the car. So never leave home without them. I apologize a little bit for my appearance tonight. I was chasing my dog this morning, and he won, and I got this black eye out of it. But it's away from the camera, so that's... So the dog's just fine.
I talked back to my wife once and had something like that.
So it's also very special for me to be in Coatesville tonight because, as you will see, my story really begins and ends in Coatesville. So with that teaser, we'll go ahead and I'll explain to you what happened. This was actually 5 years ago when I had my light bulb moment that actually involved a light bulb. I took that light bulb out one night, and on it was two things: the GE logo, which stands for American Ingenuity and Everything American, and in all caps underneath it the word China. It just grabbed a hold of me, thinking, you know, if GE, of all people, are making their light bulbs in China, maybe we have a problem. And I had just been to the Boy Scout store, and everything I bought for my son, everything was made in China, Vietnam, and Bangladesh. And our men's group at St. David's Church in Wayne had just heard from the chaplain of the Coatesville prison. He had spoken to us that morning, and I had actually volunteered in a prison ministry for 8 years. I knew there was never an excuse for committing a crime, but I was thinking that morning, wouldn't it be easier to keep the young men in Coatesville straight if they made anything there anymore? So this thing grabbed a hold of me and wouldn't let go. And I set off to pursue the three questions that Leanne mentioned to you. The first one being, well, why does it seem like it's pretty much everything we buy is made somewhere else, especially China? And isn't that causing a problem? You would think that it probably is. And if it is causing a problem, then, well, what can we do about that? So I set off on this journey to answer those three questions, and I invite you tonight to come along with me on that journey. And it ended up being 3 years later, I emerged from the Penn Library with that book as I searched for answers to these three questions. I picked up the story in 1945. So as 1945 opened, our men were fighting the Battle of the Bulge in Europe. They fought their way across Europe. By May, they had won Europe. By August, we had won Japan. And our citizen soldiers came home. One of them was my father, the man in the lower left of this picture. He was a gunner in that bomber flying out of Italy, out of Africa for the Italian campaign. 1.5 million men and women came home, and they got back to work. And in my dad's case, it was making steel. He's the one in the background, apparently learning from the old hand in the front. He was working at a steel mill in Warren, Ohio. And these soldiers came home, and they began making the power plants and the automobiles and the washing machines, all of these things made of steel in the American economy, and they set off on 30 years of a robust American economy with broadly shared prosperity. The problem was that the seeds of destruction had already been sown. In 1932, when Franklin Roosevelt was running for president, he was running on a free trade platform. And he and some of the members, the congressional candidates, were saying that the Great Depression had been caused by some tariffs. Now, where did they get the idea to have free trade in the beginning? It actually goes all the way back to Adam Smith when he was postulating the idea of a free market, that would be a good idea. He extended it to international markets. And David Ricardo said that nations should specialize in what they have a comparative advantage in. So Portugal should make wine, England should make manufactured goods. So that was the free trade theory. We had to decide in the beginning, what were we going to do as America in 1789? And in a scene right out of the hit Broadway musical Hamilton, Jefferson said, well, we'll be a gentleman's agrarian economy, we'll grow corn, and we can borrow that manufacturing stuff from England. And Alexander Hamilton said, no, I don't think this is a good idea. I think we should do what England had done, build up protections, build up our industry, and that's the path we took to build up the American industrial economy. But by the time of the Great Depression, in 1929, 1930, we enacted another round of tariffs that were sponsored by two members of Congress, Smoot and Hawley. So you've heard of Smoot and Hawley, Smoot and Hawley. Well, here they are. And those who were Franklin Roosevelt and those who were running for office in 1932, and even those who were running for office in 1992, were still blaming the Great Depression on the Smoot-Hawley Act. And here you see Al Gore presenting Ross Perot with a picture of Smoot and Hawley as they were debating whether NAFTA was a good idea. Because we still had people who were thinking, oh, these tariffs are terrible, and look what they did, they caused the Great Depression. But I can assure you that there have been studies since then that say that that's really a lot of hooey, that it's not true. But nevertheless, we did adopt free trade, and in 1934, Congress enacted a law giving the president the power, without congressional approval, to negotiate away our tariffs with various countries. And they started doing it. But it didn't really come home to roost until after the war was over. And in 1945, the United States embarked on the path of free trade. So as I looked at this, I divided it into two sections. The first was these first 50 years, what I call the Japan and Free Trade Era. And here we see that we basically, one of the main things we were doing was fighting communism. And so we were taking countries like Japan and Hong Kong and saying, you're not allowed to trade with China. We're going to open our markets up to your textiles and other goods so that we can support your economy. But of course, that was at great cost to some of our industries. So meanwhile, the Japanese were saying, yeah, fine, but we don't want any of your goods. So they were purposely selling us more than we were buying from them, something that we call mercantilism. And so you had these high and low wage worlds colliding. And this thing showed up called the dollar blouse, which today would be a $10 blouse. At a time when blouses would have sold for $30 or $40 in today's dollars, here come these $10 blouses coming in. And we had this schizophrenic trade policy, on the one hand of doing that, and on the other trying to protect ourselves from these dollar blouses. So it just wasn't working. Mexico got on the act. In 1965, they said, well, this looks like a good idea. We're going to have these plants, they called maquiladora plants. We'll put them up on the border, these export processing zones, and they can only make things there to export back to the United States. And so you started seeing these plants cropping up along the U.S.-Mexican border. And we even were still fighting communism in the 1980s in the Caribbean. It was still active down there. They were, Cuba, Venezuela, they were still trying to do that. So we were giving away other industries. For the flour industry, we'd say, okay, we're going to give that to one of these Caribbean countries. So you saw industry after industry was under attack. Well, then it got more interesting. China adopted just enough capitalism to start letting investment come into their export processing zones, and they got money from the Taiwanese and the U.S., and they started changing their economy. And then in 1994, we enacted the North American Free Trade Agreement. We pulled Mexico into the agreement we had with Canada, and now you had maquiladora on steroids. You started seeing U.S. companies going just over the border, just on the other side of the Rio Grande. Another thing that happened was we formed the World Trade Organization, and Russia and India decided to be less socialist, just as China had done. Now you've got 1.5 billion new people in the world economy, desperate workers who are ready to work for a low wage. So we have what somebody called the age of oversupply, with this oversupply of workers and capital just sloshing around the world, competing with our industries. And then we had this new thing called globalization, right at the end here, around 95, you had these revolutions in communications, so we could be on the internet talking to somebody in India or China. We had these container ships that were so large you could ship anything you want to on them. And we had the global supply chains where all these components, where the companies were just out there shopping for where they could get it for the lowest price. So it was a new world. But then we entered this next 20 years. And if it was bad for those 50 years, it got worse in these 20 years that I call the era of China and globalization. So China joined the World Trade Organization. We let them in. The United States had to let them in. And in the process, we gave them our most preferential tariff treatment. Before that, they had had to come begging for it every year, causing a lot of uncertainty. We should have known better. This shows you what our trade with China looked like once they started adopting capitalism. You see our imports from them going up in the blue line, while our exports to them were really negligible. So looking at that, you'd have to say, should we do this free trade thing with China? And the answer should have been no. But Bill Clinton, a lot of office holders said, this is going to be great, we're going to be selling all this stuff to China, even though the evidence was there that it would be the opposite. And indeed, it got worse. So you see now, after 2001, once China got into the World Trade Organization, now our imports from China really took off, and the exports negligible increase. Meanwhile, what about NAFTA? NAFTA was sold, and this is a quote from Congressman Bill Richards of Texas. He said, we are going to build up a Mexican middle class, and we're going to be exporting automobiles, refrigerators, diapers to these middle class Mexicans. I mean, I'm sorry, I have to laugh. And what do? Laugh or cry? What was really going on was there was no Mexican middle class. They were exploiting these workers. I ran across the case of Rosa Moreno. Rosa Moreno made $4,800 a year making various components for these maquiladora companies. She was operating a press one night making circuit boards, and the press malfunctioned, came down on her hands and pressed her hands into the circuit board. They had to be amputated. Mexican law said that for the loss of 2 hands for the rest of your life, and she was young, that she would get $14,000. The company offered her $3,800. This is what life is like for the Mexican workers who are working in these plants. Even today, this is the same thing. They are experiencing the big squeeze. They're not being paid enough to live on. They say we are disposable. Another example, the Delphi automobile components plant, Flint, Michigan, closed there and reopened in Mexico. So we know what happened in Flint. Here you have large unemployment. Meanwhile, down in Delphi, they've got jobs, but they're like Rosa Moreno's jobs. And you've got people in in Reynosa fighting, these gangs fighting each other over who's going to sell the drugs up into Flint, Michigan, where all the unemployed people are buying drugs because they lost their jobs. It's crazy, but that's what we were doing. That's how it was working out, but you'd think we'd know better, but when we entered into bilateral agreements with Vietnam in 2001 and with North Korea in 2011. So during this era, what you saw was entire product sectors coming under attack. We already saw apparel was under attack during the Japan era. Now it was electronics. They just were all going to China. Even furniture, I didn't know until I had researched this book. I always thought I could still go down to North Carolina and see them making furniture. The furniture industry went to Indonesia, China, basically to Asia, and our furniture industry went over there and taught them how to make it. Wow. Another sector under attack was steel. If you look at the Oakland Bay Bridge project, $7 billion project, a lot of money. To try to save a few $100 million, California gave the project to Chinese companies instead of American. They had such problems with quality that it's even questionable whether they ever saved anything. One thing for sure is that there were a lot of steel workers who were not working, who were not paying taxes to build the bridge. And it wasn't just California, there's another one in New York, the Bayonne Bridge project, again, using Chinese steel to build American infrastructure. What about that light bulb I showed you earlier? The last incandescent light bulbs made by GE were made in Winchester, Virginia, but they closed that plant. And I've seen Winchester before and after, and now Winchester looks like every down-in-the-mouth former manufacturing town across America. It's really a sad thing. China took over solar voltaics. General Motors said, oh, we got a gap in our lineup. Well, rather than start making these trucks in Flint where they used to make them, they just decided to buy them from Isuzu and put the GM logo on them. So what about conditions abroad? We talked about Rosa Moreno, but what was going out there on the other side now with all these people making these things we were importing? So I'm here tonight to tell you, your smartphone was made in a labor camp. Your clothes were made in a sweatshop, and your fish were caught on a slave ship. The Foxconn factory that makes our iPhones has these dormitories adjacent to it where they sleep 6 to a room and have to stand in line to go to the bathroom and make their clothes in between their 12-hour shifts working 6 days a week. They were jumping off the roof to commit suicide. So rather than change the working condition, Foxconn installed some nets so that they couldn't commit suicide anymore. These women are working on the island of Mauritius in a clothing sweatshop. Same thing. They live in an adjacent dormitory, just like at Foxconn, 16 to a room, making $150 a month. And they have to sign a 3-year contract to be away from their families, thousands of miles away, because they may be from India or someplace, to make these clothes. And ironically, the t-shirt they are holding was made for a women's organization in England. And the t-shirt reads, "This is what a feminist looks like." These women said, we don't feel like feminists, we feel exploited. And here you see a picture of some young men on one of the Thai slave ships. This was really just discovered in 2015 when the Associated Press unearthed this story. These are migrant workers who come into Thailand from other Southeast Asian countries. They are duped to get onto these ships, and then they can't get off them because what they do is they just offload their catch onto a mothership that takes it ashore. And so they'll spend up to 3 years just captives on these ships. So there it is, 70 years of free trade. Why did this happen? Why did we do this? So our leaders had several specific versions of free trade that they pursued. One of them being the one I mentioned earlier, that countries should go operate where they have a comparative advantage. We should just do the things we have an advantage, let the rest of the world do that. The problem with that is that today, technology and capital crosses borders, so there's no competitive advantage that's immutable. It'll be here today and gone tomorrow. And if you specialize in something, you're vulnerable because you're subject to the market of just that thing. So they said, well, what we'll do is we'll just have all that low-skill work done offshore. We'll keep all the high-skill work here in America. I call that the Lake Wobegon economics, after Garrison Keillor, who said, at Lake Wobegon, where all the children are above average. So, but unfortunately, all Americans aren't above average. And I hate to tell you this, but half of Americans are below average. And they need to do these jobs. We don't have these jobs to give away. You have people with the upper 5% trying to make policy for the rest of the 95%. So, well, what about if we have the low-tech things made offshore and we'll do the high-tech things here at home? That could work out well, except that all those other countries aren't buying into that. And so you see them making very sophisticated things there and wanting to make even more sophisticated things. For example, in the China 25 program, where China wants to get into ever higher technology things. So other countries aren't going along with that one. And then this is the most laughable one, but I swear this actually was adopted by many of our academics and political leaders, and that is, well, we don't really need to make anything anymore anyway. We're going to be a post-industrial society, and we're just going to do services. But there's been no successful country that has ever done that. Every successful country, Germany, Japan, now China, and of course the United States, built their economy on manufacturing. And besides, we can't even keep the services because now we see them going to India. Now that we've got the internet, we can't just say, oh, we're only going to do services. So there are these flawed theories. There are these 70 years of doing this. How's that worked out? Well, if you take a snapshot last year, we imported 800 billion more goods from other countries than we sold to them. That's a lot of money that we were pouring into other people's economies instead of our own. Well, what about services? That's just trade in goods. Can't we make up for that with services? And indeed, we do run a surplus in services, but as you see by this graph, the surplus in services on the top can't go near making up for the deficit in goods on the bottom, and it never will. A handful of countries have intentionally been selling us more than they buy from us. That's what I was referring to earlier as mercantilism. It has been Japan, Germany, Mexico, Canada, although that was mostly oil. But then you see what happened in 2001 when China entered the Free Trade Organization, the World Trade Organization. That is a startling curve. I can tell you that I stood up when I ran across that one. And so you see that China now is accounting for nearly half of our trade deficit, just the one country alone. And when you add it all up, we sent $19 trillion in today's dollars to these other countries since 1971, which was the first year that we ever had a trade deficit. Before that, it was always surpluses. From then through 2017, $19 trillion that could have been in our economy. So that brings us to the second question. Oh my gosh, you look at that and you think, well, isn't that causing a problem? This is the second big question of the book. So we look at the job losses and their effects. And here you see U.S. employment in manufacturing. At its peak in 1979, it just kind of went along until the first recession in 2001 and then in 2008. But remember, 2001 was that special year. And not much of a recovery. You see these kind of double ski dip of losses. We lost 1 of every 3 manufacturing jobs. 7 million of them. Where did they go? Was this all automation? What happened to these jobs? Well, if we look at this and you look at when those jobs started going away, you see that it's exactly the same time as that started happening. Now, you and I, as laymen, don't need to think about that anymore. It's pretty obvious what's going on. But actually, economists have done statistical studies, and they've connected those job losses with these Chinese imports. And indeed, many of those lost manufacturing jobs were going to China. Well, what happened when the jobs left? What you get is this cascading results that you get a slack labor market, leads to unemployment. And with all these unemployed people, now you've got low pay because they're all supply and demand. They're pushing pay down across the economy. So now you've got dependency. Families can't make it on their own. And you get social ills. They don't have any money to spend, so you have slack demand in the economy, and you get a stagnant economy, and you get this circle going again. Now, it wasn't all trade. Automation has played a big part in this. Bad immigration policies have played a big part in this, both low-skill and high-skill workers. The pursuit of shareholder value to the exclusion of everything else has played a part in this. And probably most importantly, the failure to share the gains of the economy broadly as we did in the past. You see here, if you look at incomes from 1967 through 2015, really only the top fifth was gaining appreciably, and especially the top 5% were doing better after 1980. Before that, you see it was just kind of lurching along the same. So what we saw was more of the gains being kind of going up to the upper 20, upper 5, and upper 1%. So what we've created is this harsh economy. People report, they did a poll, and 47% of Americans said they couldn't come up with $400 without having to borrow it or sell something if they had an emergency. If people lost their job, the people in the middle fifth would say we could last a week, and the people in the first and second fifth said we're out of money. So you've got 3/5 of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. And people feel, and rightly so, that there's no solid ground anymore. So when they do polling about what keeps people up at night, you see what keeps people up at night. They're afraid of losing their job, not being able to pay the mortgage, their financial situation. They're afraid that they're going to come out on Friday and they're going to be told that their plant is closing or that their jobs are being moved to India. I call it the Chutes and Ladder Society. You may know this game. I have some young kids, so I know that you can work your way up in this game. You can do all the right things, but you hit one of those chutes and you're going to be sliding back down. And that's what's happening in America today. People can be playing by all the rules, doing all the right things, working hard by their American values, but it isn't enough because somebody decided it was better to move that plant to Mexico. Well, what does the future hold? This is the past. It's kind of a grim diagnosis of the past. What's the prognosis? To look at the future, I realized that China plays such a large role in all of this that it really deserves its own special treatment. So if you look at what's been happening in China, they had natural resources. They had hundreds of millions of laborers. They needed capital and they needed technology, and they got it from us. They got it from the Taiwanese, so that we got cheap products from them, and our companies got access to the U.S. market, to the Chinese market. You notice that one technology. This is what these 301 tariffs are all about. The president said China's been stealing our technology. I mean, they may be getting it just by making a company give it to the joint venture in China, or they may just be doing outright cyber theft or espionage. But in fact, the White House staff counted 35 different ways China is stealing technology recently. It's worked out pretty well for them. You see that GDP for manufacturing in China has far outstripped the United States, Japan, and Germany by 2008. And if you look at their economy and you adjust it for prices, their economy became larger than ours in 2014. And they've done this with a certain version of capitalism where they give their companies subsidies with low interest loans, cheap electricity. They put up barriers to foreign products. They give them incentives for exports. And so they've got this whole range of things they've been doing to achieve these results with our cooperation. But that's not all they've been doing. They also are up to something else. And something we all need to keep in mind every day as we think about this is that they went through what they call the century of humiliation, starting in the 1840s through 1945, first at the hands of the Western colonial powers and then Japan. This is pretty recent memory. Stop and think about that. So they are embarked on what they call the Great Rejuvenation. China is going to retake its position. And indeed, there was a time when China, not the United States, occupied 25% of world GDP. They want that again. So they're engaging in economic imperialism. They're building infrastructure in developing countries around the world. Cultural imperialism. They have Chinese centers in our universities that they fund so they can tell our university students how great socialism is. And they've been embarked on military imperialism. This is a map of the South China Sea. You can't see it very well, but China's on the top, Vietnam on the left, Philippines, Indonesia. The dashes there were drawn by China back in the 1940s, and they basically have claimed the entire South China Sea as being Chinese property. And Chinese, at that red arrow is a plaque on the ocean floor. And Chinese students have drilled into their head that that's the southern tip of China, that China extends that far. So they have militarized all these islands down there in the center middle of the China Sea. And now they're saying that, oh, you guys aren't allowed in there. And just Sunday, they came within 40 feet of one of our ships.
Wow.
We had to take evasive action not to hit the Chinese, and they're giving us warnings. You know, you're not allowed here. So,
Wow.
so this is not just they're not playing around. Well, what else does the future hold? I say more trouble with trade, and there's going to be more trouble with NAFTA. So just in the last few days, you've heard that there's a new NAFTA, but the new NAFTA isn't very different from the old NAFTA. If we look at what's been going on under NAFTA, we had Ford Motor Company saying we're going to move all of our small car production to Mexico. Of course, they changed their mind, decided to send it to China instead. We all heard about the Carrier air conditioning debacle during the presidential campaign, where Carrier closed its plant in Indiana, moving it to Mexico. And the one that I hated the most was Nabisco and Oreos, which they made in Chicago starting in 1923. They were bringing in a new line of equipment that was going to require not 600 but now 300 workers, so you see the automation at work there. But they didn't install the equipment in Chicago, they installed it in Mexico. And here's why. in Mexico, they pay the workers 1/10 of what they pay them in Chicago. Well, this is a company that you or I could call tonight and say, we want to move our entire manufacturing operation to Mexico, and they will do it for us, turnkey. And they advertise these rates. They're saying to the U.S. company, come on down, because this is what we pay our workers. So basically, a $15 an hour worker in America is a $1.50 an hour worker in Mexico. $30 an hour here is $3 an hour there. And so you can't get around that. You can amend NAFTA all you want, and they've got this provision now, oh, so many jobs have to be $16 an hour jobs. And I say try to raise a family on $16 an hour. That's really not much of an improvement. More trouble with trade. We see our auto components going more and more offshore. These, well, first of all, this is our trade in goods with China, and although the president's doing his best, we see our deficit with China is larger this year than it was last year, because when we're feeling good with our money, where do we buy the stuff? We're buying it from China. And the auto components, this was my car battery, and I noticed that the connector was made in China. Now somebody used to make those in the United States. What are they doing now in that community? And this is our trade with China in auto parts, and you see where that's headed. So I noticed that cars, like a GM car that was 70% U.S. content 2 years ago is now 60% or 65% U.S. content. It keeps shrinking as they get more and more of their components from Asia. More trouble with trade in Asia. Here's one of these charts with Vietnam. This another one that really made me stand up. Where is that chart going? The blue line is their exports to us, and the orange line is what we're selling them. So the Labor Department does predict more job losses in manufacturing. The U.S. Steel Mill in Granite City came to my attention. 2,000 workers. It had closed down in 2016 because of this global overcapacity in steel. Steel prices plummeting. U.S. Steel had closed that plant. 2,000 workers. I mean, this was the engine of that community. With the imposition of the steel and aluminum tariffs, 500 of those jobs have come back. They've done a partial reopening. And the future, I say, is the tide is still going out, not just on the manufacturing jobs, but on the white-collar jobs as well. Large percentages of our jobs can be sent offshore. And now even those design jobs, all those good jobs we were supposed to keep, the consultants call that knowledge process outsourcing. They'll tell you how to have that done in India for half or a quarter of the price. So here we are. Yes, our household incomes have recovered from that dip back up to where they were, but they're flat. And again, part of the reason for that is that a lot of our economic gains are being captured by a small percentage of the population. So what we see there is not just people losing jobs, not just lower pay, but you get these social ills. There's a couple of Princeton economists who study what they call deaths of despair. And these are deaths from drug overdoses, suicide, and drinking yourself to death. And they've looked at one particular group, which is white, middle-aged Americans, and counted these depths of despair. And the statistics show this curve that you see here with these deaths of despair just taking off and still going up. Now there's an interesting thing. When you look at that red circle, when did that start? 2001. When did those jobs go away? 2001. And when did China start selling us so much more than they buy from us? 2001. In fact, when you put those two charts next to each other, it's really dramatic. And indeed, there have been some economic studies that have shown a statistical correlation that in those communities that came under fire from Chinese competition with factories closing, that more of these deaths of despair are occurring there. And that's just, a picture tells 1,000 words. So yes, we have these economic strategic thinking we should be engaging in. And if we are moving people from dependence to independence, that's the best thing we can do for the federal deficit. And strategically thinking, we have to decide, are we going to be Germany or are we going to be Greece? Are we going to be a manufacturing economy, or are we going to try to survive on tourism and who knows what else? And this, I came up with this little name for this pernicious circle, because when you really stop and think about this, you see how foolish it is. With the U.S. government giving subsidies to our families that can't make a go of it, so they can purchase things at Walmart, because it's the only place they can afford to buy anything. Walmart buys the goods in China. The Chinese manufacturer pays taxes to the Chinese government. They're sitting on a pile of money, so they lend it to the U.S. government, because the U.S. government doesn't have enough money for all these subsidies, and so the U.S. government takes that borrowed Chinese money, gives it to the U.S. citizens so they can buy some more Chinese stuff in Walmart. As if that weren't bad enough, there is this other aspect to this, the national security. I have recently befriended a woman named Rosemary Gibson, who spent almost the same 3 years writing her book, but what she came across was the fact that we are getting most of our pharmaceuticals now from China. She unearthed this. I had no idea, even when I was researching my book, that now the active pharmaceutical ingredients and their building blocks are coming out of China, even for the generics that are being made in India. So we have this big national security question. Do we really want to depend on China for all of our medicines? So also, do we want to have to give in to them if we have a difference of opinion in foreign policy, and they're going to say, oh, well, maybe we won't sell you your medicines next month. And of course, there's this military imperialism. So globalization is failing. Here we see the surplus and deficits of the top 10 countries, and you see that there's a handful of countries at this end who are successfully selling more to everybody else than they're buying from them. So they're boosting their economies at everybody else's expense, and you see who's the world's biggest chump, the one whose expense it is at the most is the United States over on the other end. We actually have policymakers who think that's okay. Here's how else globalization is failing. It's just a bunch of companies going around the world looking for the lowest labor wages. And so you see this lower curve is where we have devalued the actual making of things, because we've devalued the people that are doing the making. So we're left with two rationales now for free trade. One is the low price of everything we're buying is worth all these sacrifices required to get them. But here's the problem. Trade can lower wages farther than it lowers prices. So if you take a typical family making $50,000 a year, taking home $40,000 a year, maybe they spend $10,000 of that on consumer goods. So if they can buy that stuff abroad, maybe they're going to save 30%. So they're going to save $3,000 a year by buying these foreign goods. But what if the loss of all those jobs, pouring all those people into the economy, or the threat of the loss of those jobs, has driven everybody's wages down? If that family's wages go down 10%, their take-home pay goes down $4,000 in order to save $3,000 so it's a false saving. Here's all these lost jobs, the low pay, these social ills from sending this production offshore is worth it. It's outweighed by lifting all these millions of people around the world and their families out of poverty. So here's the problem with that, of volunteering ordinary Americans to that project. This fellow, a Polish man, was in Auschwitz during World War II. And they had a rule that if anybody escaped, in order to discourage escapes, the commandant said, I'm going to take 10 men out of that bunkhouse and I'm going to throw them in this basement until they die of starvation. So this was supposed to be a deterrent. But one guy did escape. He was in Francis's cell block. Francis was one of the 10 men chosen to die on account of this escape. And he called out, but what about my wife and my children? Well, this fellow was also in his cell block, a Catholic priest named Maximilian Kolbe. And he stepped forward and said, Mr. Commandant, I'm a priest, I don't have any wife and children, let me replace that man. And I don't know what mood the commandant was in that day, but he decided to let him do it. And Maximilian Kolbe did go in, and he was the last of the 10 to die. And for the next 50 years, Francis returned to Auschwitz paying his respects. And he was present when John Paul II sainted Maximilian Kolbe. Now, let's consider another story. Let's say that the town officials around Auschwitz were going out and saying to people, we've got this deal with the commandant, and for every person we bring in, they're going to release 10. So Tom, we volunteered you for that. We laugh, and yet that's exactly what we are saying to the men and women working in these factories. And when we tell them that we're closing their factory and sending their job overseas so that we can raise 10 people out there up above $2 a day into the global middle class. And thank you for volunteering for that. So it's like we're intentionally destroying our industrial base and our communities. And we're doing so at the expense of those who are least able to bear it. So I say that our leaders have failed us. And as I was thinking about this, and I used to work in Washington. I worked for a congressman. So I wrote a letter from Washington to the residents of anywhere, USA. Oh, your life has been ruined and your community too? Oh, I'm sorry, but you know, that's just the cost of the increase in welfare everybody is experiencing through the lower prices of the things being made and done abroad. You know, this is all due to unstoppable forces beyond our control, and there are going to be winners and losers. And besides, you don't have to be a loser. You need to get out there and retrain yourself for a high-skilled job. What's that you say? You don't have the money to live on while you go to school full-time? And what's that you say? There are no jobs to train for? And what's that you say? You have an IQ of 100 and aren't so good at school, but you're a hard worker? I'm sure you'll figure it out. In the end, though, it was worth it because you and everyone else in America is better off because we can buy our $10 shirts and get 30% off on our furniture. And oh yeah, so are those foreign workers who got your jobs. We're raising them all up into a new global middle class. Isn't it wonderful? Thanks for doing your part to make it happen. You're the best. Say hello to everyone for me. I hope you guys are doing okay. So what we're doing reminded me of a German theologian during World War II, Martin Niemöller, who asked this, thinking about who will speak up for the ordinary Americans. Niemöller said, first they came for the socialists, this is the Nazis, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And our situation is so dire, and so many lives and communities have been destroyed, that I believe it's apt to paraphrase Niemöller. First they came for the shoe industry, but I was not a shoemaker, so I did not speak out. And then they came for the furniture industry, but I was not a craftsman, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the steel industry, but I was not a steel worker, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the computer industry, but I was not an assembly worker, so I did not speak out. Then they came for the software industry, but I was not a programmer, so I did not speak out. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. You notice that what Niemöller is saying is both altruism and self-interest. That yes, we have a moral duty to look out for these other Americans, but we need to be watching out for ourselves and for our children and our family members, because it may be our job that's the one that the next one that's offshored. And not just for us now, but for the next generations. This is one of my favorite pictures of my children taken a few years ago at a Memorial Day parade. Here they are, they're all full of joy and good hope and energy. But that picture haunted me because I looked at it and I thought, what about their future? What do I suggest that they study to do that isn't going to be offshored and sent to India or someplace? I say we're trading away their future. So I say we need to break out of this dogma of free trade. It's like a religion. These patently false propositions that this is a win-win and these are socially optimal outcomes. That's actually the words the economists use. And the unethical proposition of destroying Americans' lives in the name of low price or solving poverty in other countries. I say it's serious enough to think back to the words of Abraham Lincoln, this dogma that we're in the thrall of, as if we're under some magician's spell. And he said, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. So what can be done about it? The first thing I think we need to think about is there a better vision for what we're doing? And I say we return to the American dream and American values of hard work and family and the idea that there will be a better future for our children. We return to the idea of the dignity of the individual, of a life of dignity where you don't need a handout, and of economic gains that are widely shared among all of us as we produce this gross national product. We can then, if we do this, we can get back into the virtuous circle where people have some money in their pocket to spend, because it's the consumer with money in their pocket that drives the economy. How will we do that? This is what struck me right in the beginning, and it stayed true throughout, and that is that we, as consumers, are 70% of the economy, so we have the power to change this. We can be the ones who break the cycle, the vicious circle, by bringing those foreign jobs home and getting the virtuous circle going again. Well, is there enough of our spending to do that? I counted up $600 billion just in deficits, whereas we consumers are buying $600 billion more goods from overseas than we're selling to them. And as you see on this chart, $200 billion of that is automobiles and components. So if we were to just bring home $500 billion of our spending, that's enough to balance trade. Doesn't mean we stop importing anything. We could create 6 million jobs, take the slack out of the economy, and get that virtuous circle going again. In communities, you would see a reduction in all these social ills as families become independent, able to pay taxes, and get these communities back on their feet. Well, $500 billion, 6 million jobs, that sounds great, Jim, but what can one person do? So the first thing you can do is buy an American car. I showed you that $200 billion of that deficit was automobiles and components. And the first thing everybody always asks me is, well, great, Jim, but what's an American car? Yeah. Well, let's start with this. Let's start with a car that has 60 to 70% U.S. content. It beats the heck out of a car with 0 U.S. content that was imported from Korea. That's a lot of jobs. And you can find out. There are ways that I've put on my website where we can look and see. And just take a little time before we make that big expenditure to see that even if it was a Honda, it was made in Kentucky with 70% U.S. content. And now we're being thoughtful consumers. Oh, you're not ready to buy a car? Well, it's kind of pedestrian, but buy yourself a set of tires made in America. It's not a small purchase, $250 a tire. Just all you have to do is make sure your tire guy, that these came from an American factory, and they'll do it for you. And become a label reader. This is the Penn bookstore, and here you see these calendars. It's an Italian brand, Moleskine, but they were making them in China until they decided that it got too expensive there, so now they're making them in Vietnam. But just across the aisle is this stand from Chinola, and they're making those in Detroit. Americans are making these in Detroit, and they don't cost $1 more. All you have to do is stop and think. Here's another even more pedestrian item. I was looking for razors. Well, Bic, it's a French company. You'd expect it to be made in France, and indeed it is. But what about Gillette? That's an iconic American brand. No, that's made in Mexico. But just by taking the time to look at the three, I discovered that the Schick was indeed made in USA. So without spending a penny more, I have supported American workers instead of sending those jobs abroad. So we can stay informed. We can spread the word. And I have, at the end of this process, come up with an initiative that I call Made in America Again. So it has a nonprofit, a 501c3, to get the message I'm sharing with you tonight out there so that Americans can wake up to the idea that we can't do this to our children, we can't be trading away their future, but we have the power to change that. But it is hard to find the American-made stuff sometimes, and so I thought, well, the internet should be able to solve that problem. So I'm putting up a website where you could go, perhaps you shop on Wayfair, that kind of a website where you can go and be pretty sure you're going to be able to find something made in America with a majority U.S. content. So it'd be kind of a one-stop shop for American made. Now, the thing I love about this is that we don't need to ask the government for support or permission to do any of this, but there's a couple of things that would be nice if they would do. One would be to have clear labeling of goods in packaging and advertising so we can tell where the heck something is from. And the other is when our government is spending our money, have them buy something made in the USA. So there it is. Those are the three components. The thing I love is that, as grim as that history was, this is an actionable plan that we can pursue. Another example, my son asked me for a hammer. I had my hammer that I used when I was working in college, made in America. I went and I had two choices for him. The one was an Estwing, one was made in Hungary for $15, and the other was made by Estwing in Wisconsin for $25. So for the price of 2 lattes, I could buy the $25 hammer, and I would be supporting the American dream because there would be somebody working in that factory in Wisconsin who could send their children to college. I had the power to do that, and every day we are making these decisions. So as I was completing work on the book, I came out here to Coatesville, having heard the chaplain in the beginning, and let me just, so the Coatesville really is at the very first page and the last page of the book. I drove out to Coatesville, site of the prison whose chaplain had been part of my light bulb moment. There I found an enormous steel mill built on over 900 acres along the path of the Brandywine River. Across the street, a small portion of the mill, now owned by the global international steel conglomerate, ArcelorMittal, is still operating, making steel plate. But most of the mill, covering many acres, stands empty and quiet. The building that formerly housed the executive administrative offices is now largely occupied by the National Iron and Steel Heritage Museum, recounting the history of the mill which produced the steel of which the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were constructed. So now you know why I'm so happy to be here tonight. Between the building's parking lot where I stood and the high blank wall of the mill ran a rail line, and on it came a single diesel locomotive. And the engineer gave out a long, loud blast of its air horn, and the sound reverberated off the walls of the mill. I was carried back to a night when I was 4 or 5 years old. My family was paying a visit to my mother's parents in Braddock, Pennsylvania, just out Pittsburgh, and they deposited me in a bedroom to sleep while the grown-ups visited. They lived in a group of buildings they called the Project at the top of a hill overlooking the U.S. Steel Corporation's plant, built by Andrew Carnegie in 1875, where my grandfather worked. And in the darkness, rolling up the hill, I could hear deep, booming sounds of large metal objects colliding, of things quite literally going bump in the night. I had an abiding feeling that big things were happening down there, and they were. That mill is still in operation, but the mill in Bethlehem, the mill in Granite City, most of it, stand closed. Will the mill in Granite City reopen? Or will it fall victim to the Chinese overcapacity in steel? As goes that mill, I say, so goes the country. We have the opportunity to decide which way it goes. We hold the key to a better future, the American dream restored, simply by exercising the power of consumer choice. And we can stop trading away our children's future, bring the jobs home, and rebuild our economy and our communities. So I invite you tonight to join me in that effort. There's much to learn, and I hope that you're intrigued enough that you'd like to delve into the book and learn more. I hope you'll want to stay informed about new developments, and you can do that on the website I've created. You can leave your email address on a page I've left here if you'd like, and I'll stay in direct contact with you. And finally, an undertaking of this scope will require resources. So I am currently raising funds for the nonprofit and for the public benefit corporation that is building these websites. So I would be pleased to have your support and any suggestions you have for anyone who you think might be interested in this project, because I believe that this is something that can be done this is a real solution because it's in the hands of consumers. It can be done. But I emphasize that I believe our window of opportunity will soon close. I pray that we will disenthrall ourselves from the dogma of free trade in time before it's too late. And I think that the best and necessary first step is for all of us to decide that we are in this together and we will do what it takes for communities across America to say, we make things here again. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Yes, Skip Houston of the Houston Family Foundation. We're located here in Coatesville, and I'm part of the family of the Lucas Steel Company family. And I think what you have done and what you have said here has been fantastic. And I've just asked if we could get several cartons of the books that you have that we put in the store here, and we can give out as gifts to people in the community and around the country that we know, to have them read this, as well as members of Congress. I was the Vice President of Government Relations, and I know how things work in Washington. I would like to send some of these books also to our senators and congressmen.
I would love that. I
We'll
would definitely take you up
We'll
on
work
that.
with you together on that.
That sounds great.
Thank you.
It was a larger undertaking than I expected. I thought it was a one-year project. And I had gone to Penn as an undergraduate, and I had written my senior thesis in this library, and I went back, and it was like writing 10 of them at once. And I watched 3 convocations and nearly 3 graduations before I emerged with this book. But it's been a labor of love, and I think it does answer questions that I had that I didn't think anybody else had answered.
Right.
And got them all under one cover. And I think that we really need to get this word out.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good.
I'm really delighted to be with you guys tonight. Yes, sir.
Will you write a Make America Great Again addendum
Tell me more.
for Mr. Trump's
Well,
programs?
it's interesting that you mentioned that. So the third component that I have was this other nonprofit. It's a 501c4 where we want to pursue, I mentioned clear country of origin labeling and Buy American policies by government. So the clear labeling, actually, I have joined another organization, much like the one I formed, called the Coalition for a Prosperous America. And it's manufacturers, farmers, labor unions, who are doing things here. And so they've gotten some access to the White House, and the White House actually asked them if they had anything they could propose on labeling. So I did draft an executive order that I think the president may be signing soon. I'm pretty excited about that, where he would direct his department heads to start enforcing the law, because the law said this is stuff supposed to be prominently displayed. And to me, that means on the face of the package.
Right.
So we can make an informed decision. I think consumers have the right to know where these things are from. So I'm kind of excited. I think that if you'll watch for this, you may be seeing the president sign something along those lines.
I would think he would like that subject.
Yep. And then there are some things where I think the law needs to be improved so that in advertising and on the internet that we can do the same thing, that I don't think there's current authority under the law. And so going back to my own experience, I was a legislative assistant and did some lobbying for one of the DC law firms. I have drafted a bill that we're going to try to get through Congress that would really tighten these laws so that consumers can bring their purchasing power to bear on this. Because companies love to hide the ball. They don't want to stop and thinking about this.
Very good.
Do you know if the American Navy is building ships with U.S. steel?
I believe they are.
United States made steel?
Yeah.
I can answer that.
Oh, good. Go ahead. We got an answer?
We do Coast Guard cutters right here. The Ford class aircraft carrier right here. 3 submarines coming up, being done right here.
Good for you.
So is it exclusively American-made steel, do you know, or are we
It's,
going offshore for anything now?
I can't answer that. I know a lot of the, I know a high percentage of it will be Coatesville product.
Great.
It's good to hear.
Good question, though.
Add that into your talking if you.
Yes. Well, it's interesting. Actually, the administration right now is working on an assessment of our defense reliance on foreign products in those supply chains. So not just steel, but especially, for example, in electronics. we become reliant on the Chinese, and it's possible they could even be giving us things that could sabotage us in the time of war. So I think we're going to see a report come out on that subject. And besides that executive order I just mentioned to you, I'm working with Rosemary and CPA on an initiative by the White House to reduce or eliminate our dependency for medicine on our potential adversaries. And I think we may see something coming out on that too. So I say that this was not inevitable and this is not irreversible. Good. And I've really been dismayed by all the people. I hate this phrase and I'm going to ban it from the English language. Those jobs are not coming back. Anybody ever heard that one?
Oh, yes.
No, I said no. This was not inevitable. It's not irreversible. If we will just come to our senses and break out of this thrall, the thrall that we've been in. And I'm very encouraged. I think that there's been a growing recognition coming out of the 2016 campaign. Certainly Trump supporters, but even Bernie Sanders supporters realized globalization was not working. These are the people who were protesting in Seattle. So this comes from a lot of different directions that makes me hopeful that people are going to come to our senses and we can rise up and tell our elected officials, get my book to the members of Congress and say, this isn't working, we've got to do something differently.
Have you made a film or this presentation?
This is it tonight.
Excellent presentation. I know we're doing it here.
Yeah, no, I have not before. I've taped it twice before, but not in a fashion that I thought was really suitable.
I think it would be fantastic if we get something like this, and we can actually send it to our congressmen and senators, especially in the Pennsylvania where we have steel companies, and we want to make sure we continue those steel companies and have these steel companies grow. And
yes.
I think we can do that in the United States and other products once they see this film of this project, what you've done today. And I think your presentation has been really exciting and excellent.
I'm delighted to hear that. I'm really glad to hear that because I put my heart into this.
I can see it.
It's been, my heart rests with my family history of everybody working in these mills. The mill that was in the Deer Hunter was in Mingo Junction, Ohio.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that's where my mother and father grew up, and everybody worked in that mill.
I'm a Buckeye.
Oh, okay. I was born in Warren when my dad was working there.
No, I'm not talking football.
Yeah. We're talking birthright here.
This is a tough weekend.
I know.
For us Penn Staters.
Yeah.
No, but I think this presentation has been excellent tonight, and I almost would like to see it over again. I'm glad we're filming it. Because
yes.
I think it's something we should show several times, because as thorough as it was, there's so many points in there that I'd like to see again and have other people see it, maybe have a separate presentation of this, because it's a very valuable program you had tonight. This is good.
I'm delighted to hear that. I hesitate, as you can imagine, there's so much material here to really say everything I said tonight, so I'm really glad to have your response.
It's been excellent.
Yeah, that's great. Yes?
See, a lot of these decisions, they're not consumer or even worker driven, they're investor driven, because I do tell you as a steel worker, the last Edison-based light bulb was made right here in Pennsylvania, U.S. made. It was right here in Pennsylvania. That was Sylvania Osram. They were steel worker represented. And they decided they weren't, we even extended that plant life for a while when they came up with the halogen.
Yep.
With the Edison base. That they no longer wanted to make it here because they could make it cheaper elsewhere.
Exactly, yeah.
So,
and I think that's why the consumer solution is so necessary, because in many industries what happens is, this may not have happened with them, but it certainly happened with furniture. You have somebody else who went offshore and now they're selling their product for 30% less than yours. And as long as the American consumer is ready to go for the low price, then they'll go out of business or they have to go offshore. But if Sylvania knew that they couldn't sell the light bulb made in Mexico, and if Nabisco knew they couldn't sell the Oreo made in Mexico, that people wouldn't stand for that. If Buick knew that people wouldn't buy these darn Envisions they're making in China, it's just crazy. But so many Americans just don't understand this, and they're going, oh, it doesn't matter where my car's made. So consumers are not only are they the solution, they must be the solution, because as long as we consumers are going along with those kind of decisions, then they'll continue to be made.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. It's great. This is really, really nice. I really am grateful for your response. I'm glad to be with everybody tonight. So I'll be around for any further conversations you'd like to have. If anyone's interested in purchasing a book, I'll give you the in-person $20 a price instead of the $25 you pay on Amazon. And but I'll be very happy to have some more conversations. Glad to be with everybody. Thank you.
Good. Thanks.
So you retired in 1984? How many years? Makes you what, 85 now?
Spending a lot of time in sales in my life. One of my favorite books is Sam Walton's biography,
Oh, yeah?
Mr. Walmart.